A millionaire forced his daughter to work as a waitress to punish her. However, he was left stunned by what his daughter did. Howard Thompson had long felt the weight of responsibility. As both a father and a self-made millionaire, he watched with a quiet frustration as his daughter Lila slipped further into a life of extravagance and irresponsibility. Growing up surrounded by luxury, she'd never known a day of struggle. And it showed in every thoughtless action, every careless comment. Howard, a man who had built his empire from the ground up, had hoped Lila would understand that privilege came with responsibilities, but his efforts had been met only with her defiance. Until now, seated across from her at the grand dining table in their sprawling estate, Howard felt a surge of resolve. Lila barely looked up from her phone, a slight pout on her lips as she scrolled absently through social media. Howard cleared his throat, and the silence that followed was heavy. "Lila," he began, his voice steady but unyielding. "We need to talk." She rolled her eyes, still not looking up. "Dad, we already had this conversation about 100 times. I don't know what else you expect me to say." Howard clenched his jaw but kept his tone even. "That's the problem, Lila. You're not saying anything or doing anything that shows me you have the slightest bit of understanding or gratitude." Finally, she looked up, her brows furrowing in mild irritation. "So what? You want me to volunteer at some soup kitchen or donate to charity? We have enough money for that kind of thing." Howard's frustration hit a peak, and he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "This isn't about money, Lila. It's about you learning the value of it. You've never worked a single day in your life, never known what it means to earn even $1, and that ends now." Lila's expression shifted to one of mild disbelief, her eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether her father was serious. "What are you saying?" He took a deep breath. "Starting Monday, you're going to be working at a restaurant. It's a modest place, nothing like the ones you're used to, but that's the point. You'll work there as a waitress until you understand what it means to work hard, to earn your way." The shock was visible on her face as she processed his words, her mouth opening slightly, only to close in a tight, defiant line. "You can't be serious," she managed after a pause, her voice tinged with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Oh, I'm very serious," Howard replied, his gaze unwavering. "You'll work there until I say otherwise, and if you refuse, then you'll find yourself without the comforts you've taken for granted." Her face flushed with anger, and she slammed her phone down on the table. "You're punishing me for what? For being your daughter?" "No," Howard said calmly, though his eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "I'm teaching you. I didn't work my whole life just to watch you throw away everything I've built. You've had it too easy. Lila, and that changes now." Lila laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and edged with rebellion. "You can't just force me into some low-paying job. What do you think this will prove? That I'm beneath you?" Howard shook his head. "I think it'll show you that life isn't handed to you on a silver platter. I had to fight for everything I have. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help you realize that there's value in earning your place in the world." Lila's defiance wavered, just a flicker. Before her face hardened, she crossed her arms, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fine, if this is what you think I need, then I'll go. I'll work in your precious restaurant, but don't expect me to come crawling back to you, begging for forgiveness." Howard's gaze softened as he rose from his chair. "I'm not asking you to beg, Lila. I'm asking you to learn." He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the grand hallway. Lila sat alone, her thoughts racing with resentment, disbelief, and a hint of dread. She knew her father wasn't bluffing. He never was. This was real, and there was no escaping it. Her hands clenched into fists as she thought about what lay ahead. A restaurant, he'd said, as a waitress. The idea was humiliating, an insult to everything she knew. But if he thought she would break, that she'd come out of this humbled and grateful, he was wrong. She'd go through with it, but only to prove him wrong. Lila pushed her chair back and stood up, her chin high and her eyes flashing with defiance. "Fine," she muttered to herself. "If he wants me to learn, I'll give him a lesson he won't forget." But deep down, she felt the first stirrings of doubt. When Monday arrived, Lila woke up with a heavy mix of dread and determination. She was still furious with her father, replaying their conversation in her mind as she dressed. She chose the plainest clothes she could find, jeans and a t-shirt. a far cry from her usual designer wardrobe. She was determined to make it through this ridiculous punishment with her dignity intact, and, if possible, prove to her father how unnecessary the whole ordeal was. The restaurant was in a part of town she'd only ever driven through, never actually visited. As her driver pulled up, Lila looked out the window and took in the modest exterior with a grimace. "This is it," she muttered under her breath, stepping out reluctantly. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the morning rush. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and a small group of regulars sat around chatting. Lila walked in, feeling out of place, as eyes turned to her, taking in the polished look she couldn't quite hide. The manager, Carla, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, approached her. "You must be Lila. I'm Carla," she said, giving Lila a once-over with a slight smirk. "Your dad gave me a heads up." "Great," Lila replied flatly, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. Carla raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Well, here's the deal. You'll start by shadowing one of our waitstaff. Then you'll take tables on your own. Your job's to keep the customers happy, handle the orders, and clean up afterward. No excuses, no complaints." Lila's stomach churned, but she forced a polite smile. "Got it." Carla handed her a notepad and an apron, which Lila took with a barely concealed grimace. "Why don't you start with Wes?" Carla suggested, gesturing toward a young man bustling behind the counter. "He'll show you the ropes." Lila looked over, and there he was, a young man with dark hair, a broad smile, and an easygoing confidence about him. He wore the same uniform she'd been given, but somehow he made it seem comfortable. Lila took a deep breath and walked over, putting on her best "I don't want to be here" expression. "Hey, I'm Wes," he said with a friendly grin as she approached. "You're the newbie, huh?" "Looks like it," she replied curtly, adjusting the apron awkwardly. He chuckled, apparently amused by her discomfort. "It's really not that bad. You'll get used to it." "Doubtful," Lila muttered, scanning the tables filled with customers talking and laughing. She wondered how she'd make it through even one shift. "All right, first things first," Wes said, launching into an explanation of the basics. "You greet customers, take orders, refill drinks, you know, the usual, and keep your smile up. People love that." Lila gave him a tight-lipped smile, which only made him laugh. "A little more warmth. Try not to look like you're being tortured." Her face flushed. "I'm trying," she said defensively. He just shrugged. "All right. Come on, let's take that table together." They walked over to a small booth where an elderly couple sat, looking over the menu. Wes greeted them warmly, his easy charm putting them at ease immediately. Lila watched, stiffly nodding as he gestured for her to speak. "Hi, can I get you something to drink?" she asked, forcing herself to meet their eyes. The couple ordered coffee and tea, and Wes nodded at her to write it down as she scrawled the words onto the notepad. She couldn't help but feel a pang of embarrassment. Everything about this felt foreign, awkward. "Not bad for a first try," Wes said as they walked away from the table. "Just try to relax a little. It's not life or death," says the guy who's used to this, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Wes raised an eyebrow but let it slide. The rest of the shift dragged on, with Lila following Wes, carrying plates and taking orders. Each task felt like a small battle, and her patience wore thin quickly. She missed the ease of her usual life, the freedom to do whatever she wanted without someone telling her where to go, what to do, and how to act. After a few hours, Wes gave her a sympathetic look. "Hey, why don't you take 5? First days are rough. Don't have to tell me twice," she muttered, slipping into a quiet corner of the restaurant. She leaned back, closing her eyes and sighing deeply. The background noise of clinking dishes and murmured conversations filled her ears, and she couldn't help but feel out of place. She'd expected this to be easy, to breeze through it and prove her father wrong, but it wasn't. Just then, Carla walked over, arms crossed. "Break time's over," she said. "We need you back on the floor." Lila groaned inwardly, but forced herself up, plastering a neutral expression on her face. As she walked back, she caught Wes watching her, a small smile on his lips. "You're surviving," he teased as she passed him. "Barely," she replied with a smirk. The hours dragged on, and with each passing minute, Lila's exhaustion grew. She fumbled orders, got drink refills mixed up, and by the end of her shift, her feet ached and her head throbbed. She wasn't sure how people managed to do this day in and day out, and the thought unsettled her. As she took off her apron, Carla gave her a nod of approval. "Not bad for your first day," she said. "Keep it up, and maybe you'll get the hang of it." Lila nodded, too tired to argue. She slipped out of the restaurant feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. There was no escaping the fact that she'd have to come back tomorrow, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. But as she looked back at the small, bustling restaurant, she realized one thing: she'd survived. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Lila dragged herself back to the restaurant with a mix of dread and determination. She still didn't want to be here, but the challenge of enduring it, to prove to herself, and maybe even her father, that she wasn't some spoiled, helpless rich girl, gnawed at her pride. She'd never backed down from anything before, and she wouldn't start now. As soon as she entered, Carla gave her a quick nod. "Good. You're on time. Grab an apron and get started on the tables in the back. They're already filling up." Lila slipped the apron over her head and made her way toward the tables. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, hoping to just get through the day without a hitch. But it wasn't long before the small inconveniences started piling up. By her third table, she was already fumbling, juggling a tray too full with coffee mugs and dessert plates, her balance slightly off-kilter. "Careful there," Wes called from across the room with a small grin. "Thanks for the tip," she shot back, sarcasm evident in her tone. Though she didn't look at him, she was determined to manage on her own, even if her hands were trembling under the weight of the tray, as she approached a booth occupied by a young couple. She attempted to set down their drinks with a forced smile. Just as she let go, one of the mugs tilted over, sending hot coffee spilling across the table. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, grabbing napkins as the couple jumped back, trying to avoid the spill. The man gave her an annoyed look, wiping coffee off his hand. "Yeah, great job," he muttered. Lila's cheeks flushed, and she felt an immediate spike of irritation. She'd wanted to snap back, but Wes appeared beside her, offering a quick, "Sorry about that," to the couple before taking over the cleanup, once they'd left the table. Wes looked at her with a gentle smile. "Hey, it happens to the best of us." But Lila's pride was wounded. She crossed her arms, glaring at him. "I don't need you to baby me." Wes raised his hands in surrender. "All right, suit yourself, just trying to help." Lila gritted her teeth, feeling even more determined to handle things on her own. She spent the next hour dashing from table to table, trying her best to avoid any more mistakes. But her frustrations only grew. The more she tried to prove herself, the more she stumbled. By the time she reached the lunch rush, she was a tangled mess of nerves, exhaustion, and embarrassment. "Excuse me." A woman at one of her tables waved her over, an irritated frown on her face. "I've been waiting for a refill on my drink for 10 minutes. Lila gave her an apologetic nod, mentally cursing herself as she turned back to the counter to fill the order. She was trying her best, but the restaurant seemed to be running circles around her, constantly pushing her to her limits. Just then, Carla approached her, arms crossed. "Lila, can I have a word?" "Great," she thought, bracing herself for another scolding. Carla's tone was firm. "Look, I get that you're new, and it's not easy, but you need to focus more and try to anticipate what the tables need. Pay attention, watch the customers' faces, and you'll figure it out. Think you can handle that?" Lila nodded, trying not to let her frustration show. "I'll do better," she muttered. Carla gave her a quick nod, but her expression didn't soften. "Good, just keep trying." The rest of the day felt like one endless task after another. Lila's arms ached from carrying trays. Her back hurt from bending to clean tables, and her pride was bruised from all the little mistakes she'd made. By the time the shift ended, she was ready to collapse. As she headed for the back to take off her apron, Wes caught up with her, an easy smile on his face. "Rough day, huh?" She rolled her eyes. "Understatement of the year," he chuckled, leaning against the counter. "It gets easier. Just gotta keep at it." Lila scoffed, annoyed that he made it sound so simple. "For you, maybe. You actually like this job." Wes shrugged. "True, but that doesn't mean it's not tough sometimes. Especially at first. Nobody's a pro on day one or even week one. It's all about learning as you go. She glanced away, the thought sinking in despite her pride. Maybe he had a point, but she wasn't about to admit it. Whatever, she muttered. I'm not here to get attached to this place, okay? I'm just doing my time. Wes just shrugged again, unfazed by her attitude. If that's how you want to look at it. But trust me, it's a lot easier if you stop fighting it so much. Before she could respond, Carla appeared, calling out from across the room. Wes, table 7 needs clearing. On it, he replied, giving Leela a friendly nod before heading back to work. As she watched him go, a strange feeling settled over her. She'd wanted to hate this place, to get through it as quickly as possible. But somehow, she found herself caring, if only a little, about doing things right, about showing that she could handle it. Maybe it was because she'd spent so long under everyone's skeptical stares, including her father's. She couldn't stand the thought of anyone else seeing her as weak or incompetent. She sighed, slipping her apron off and hanging it on the peg by the door. As she walked out of the restaurant, she glanced back one last time, her gaze lingering on the place she'd come to despise. And now, grudgingly respect. Just get through tomorrow, she muttered to herself, one day at a time. But as much as she tried to ignore it, a part of her wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something here worth proving. If not to her father, then to herself. The next day, Lila arrived at the restaurant with a bit less dread in her steps. Though she'd never admit it, she went straight for her apron, fastening it with a practiced motion that felt surprisingly normal. After only a few days, as she made her way to the tables, she noticed Wes already at work, moving between customers with a genuine ease that she couldn't help but admire. Every time she thought she was starting to get the hang of things, she'd see him chatting easily with customers, carrying trays without a single stumble and making it all look effortless. It bugged her, honestly. Why did he make it look so easy? Ready for round 3, Wes greeted her as she approached, his smile wide and warm as usual. Do I have a choice? She replied, trying to keep her tone casual, though there was a faint, unintentional hint of curiosity in her voice. He chuckled, giving her a playful nudge. Look at you, almost starting to sound like you're enjoying this. Don't get too excited, she shot back. I'm just trying to avoid any more coffee disasters, he laughed, raising his hands in a mock show of surrender. Fair enough. Tell you what, how about I let you handle a few tables on your own today? I'll be close by if you need backup. But I think you're ready for it. Lila felt a mix of pride and nervousness. Part of her wanted to refuse, but another part felt the need to prove to herself, and maybe to him, that she could handle it. Fine, she said, attempting to sound nonchalant. Let's see if these people can handle me. Wes grinned. That's the spirit. Just take a deep breath and remember, you're here to help them, not the other way around. With a nod, Lila approached her first table solo, a family with 2 young kids who were already making a mess with their crayons and menus. She gave them her best attempt at a smile, taking their orders without dropping anything or forgetting the kids' chocolate milk requests. It wasn't graceful, but it was progress. She made it through the next few tables with fewer mistakes, only spilling a few ice cubes and mixing up 2 orders. It was nothing she couldn't handle, and as the day wore on, she felt her confidence start to grow. Wes's occasional supportive nods and small smiles helped, though she'd never tell him that. During a quick break, Lila leaned against the counter, wiping her brow. Wes sidled up beside her, sipping a soda. See? Told you you'd get the hang of it? She let out a mock sigh. Yeah, well, don't expect me to be setting any records. Everyone's gotta start somewhere, he said, glancing at her. You know, I started here as a dishwasher when I was 17. She blinked in surprise. Really? Why didn't you go to college or, I don't know, do something else? Wes chuckled, as if the question amused him. I couldn't afford college. My folks weren't around much, and I had to take care of my younger siblings. This job helped pay the bills. Lila felt a pang of sympathy. Growing up, she'd never had to think twice about money or working to support herself, let alone anyone else. She'd just assumed everyone had the same opportunities she did, and it was strange to imagine what it must have been like for Wes. So, what do you want to do? She asked, genuinely curious for the first time. He shrugged, a wistful smile on his face. My dream is to open my own auto shop someday. I've been saving for years, working extra shifts, picking up side gigs. It's slow, but I'm getting there. Lila found herself admiring his determination. He wasn't just working here as a temporary thing. He was using it to build something for himself, something real and meaningful. It was a stark contrast to her own life, where everything had been handed to her. No questions asked. "I've never really met anyone like you," she admitted, almost under her breath. Wes chuckled, giving her a sideways glance. "What? A poor guy who likes cars?" "No," she said, frowning as she struggled to put her thoughts into words. "I mean, someone who actually has a plan. Someone who doesn't just coast through life because they can." He seemed to consider this, nodding thoughtfully. "Well, everyone's got to have something to work toward, right? Otherwise, what's the point?" The words resonated with her, though she didn't fully understand why. She'd never thought much about purpose, about building something for herself, because she'd always had her father's wealth and influence to fall back on. But the more time she spent around Wes, the more she realized how empty her own life felt by comparison. "Maybe," she murmured, staring into the distance. Before she could delve any deeper into that thought, Carla's voice cut through the break room. "Lila, we've got a party of 6 in the corner. Can you handle it?" Lila's momentary softness vanished as she snapped back to the present. Squaring her shoulders, on it, she glanced at Wes, who gave her an encouraging nod, and she headed back out onto the floor, feeling a strange sense of pride swelling within her. Handling a table of 6 on her own was a daunting task, but as she took their orders, managed their requests, and kept her cool under pressure, she realized that she was actually starting to enjoy it, just a little. At the end of the day, as she was hanging up her apron, Wes passed her by, giving her a quick pat on the back. "Nice job today, I'm impressed." She raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Oh, so now I'm supposed to be flattered." He grinned. "Hey, take it or leave it." As he walked away, Lila felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Appreciation, maybe even respect. Working here wasn't exactly glamorous, and it was still the last place she wanted to be, but she couldn't deny that it was starting to mean something more than just a punishment. On the way out, she glanced back at the restaurant, feeling a strange tug at her heart. For the first time, she wasn't counting down the days until her father would let her quit. Instead, she wondered what it would feel like to finish this with a sense of accomplishment. The next few days at the restaurant were, to Lila's surprise, less grueling than before. She wasn't quite at ease yet, but she'd learned enough to navigate the tables with a bit more confidence. Every shift brought new challenges, of course. A picky customer, a table full of messy kids, or a food order she'd get slightly wrong. But with each small mishap, she'd catch herself taking a deep breath and moving on, rather than letting it ruin her day. Carla had started noticing the change in her too. The usual sharpness in her tone had softened, and she seemed slightly more patient when Lila made a mistake. One evening, as Lila was cleaning up after a particularly busy shift, Carla stopped beside her. "Not bad, Lila. You're getting quicker with the orders," Carla said, her voice carrying a hint of approval. Lila blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. Thanks," she replied, trying not to sound too surprised. Carla just nodded, and Lila found herself smiling faintly as she returned to cleaning the table. She still had her moments of frustration and self-doubt, but she could feel her confidence building little by little. She was actually starting to look forward to coming in, if only to prove to herself that she could handle it. The biggest change, though, came in her interactions with her coworkers. At first, they'd treated her like an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. But now, a few of them were beginning to warm up, cracking jokes with her between orders, or asking her about her life, questions she didn't always know how to answer, but appreciated nonetheless. One afternoon, as she was setting up the tables before the lunch rush, one of the servers, Maria, sidled up to her. "Hey Lila, do you mind covering my tables for a few minutes? My kids' school just called and I need to check in with them." Lila nodded without hesitation. "Of course, go ahead," as Maria hurried off. Wes passed by, raising an eyebrow. "Look at you, helping out and everything," he teased, a smirk on his face. Lila rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. "Guess I'm starting to get the hang of it." They worked side by side, managing orders and greeting customers, and as the day wore on, She realized just how much she'd begun to value the camaraderie among her coworkers. For the first time, she felt like part of the team. Later, during a lull in the shift, Lila noticed a family sitting in a corner booth, the parents sharing a plate while their 2 kids split a small burger and fries. It struck her, watching the parents laugh and playfully feed each other bits of food while the kids giggled over the fries. It was such a simple scene, but there was something about the family's warmth and togetherness that made her pause. Wes caught her staring. "Everything okay?" She glanced at him, feeling a pang she couldn't quite place. Yeah, nothing, it's silly." He tilted his head, giving her a curious look. "You can say it, I won't judge." She hesitated, then nodded toward the family. "I guess. I just don't see that a lot. People who actually seem happy just being together." "You know," Wes's expression softened. "Yeah, that's the thing about places like this. You see all kinds of people, but a lot of them have that same spirit. They're not here to show off or flash their money around. They're just living." Leela felt a strange weight in her chest as she thought about his words. She'd spent most of her life surrounded by wealth, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen a moment as genuine as the one unfolding in front of her. She glanced back at Wes, his face thoughtful as he watched her. "Do you ever feel like you missed out on something?" she asked softly. Barely realizing she'd spoken aloud, Wes looked at her, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, his tone gentle. "But I think what matters is what you do with what you have. If you're lucky enough to be surrounded by good people, you hold on to them. Doesn't matter how much you own or where you come from." Lila nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words sink in. For so long, she'd seen her life as perfect. Everything she could ever want, at her fingertips. But now, watching families laugh over simple meals and people connect in ways that went beyond wealth or status, she was beginning to question just how much all her privilege really mattered. As the shift wound down, Leela took it upon herself to help with tasks she'd previously ignored, wiping down tables, refilling the condiments, and even offering to carry a few plates back to the kitchen for Carla. Her coworkers noticed, and a few nodded at her in silent approval. They didn't need to say anything. The looks on their faces were enough. At the end of her shift, Carla approached her with an almost smile. "Nice work today. You're starting to fit in around here." Lila felt a warm rush of pride, though she tried to hide it with a casual shrug. "Just trying to help," she replied, her tone intentionally nonchalant. But as she walked out of the restaurant, she couldn't deny the truth. She felt good, not just because she'd made it through another shift without any major disasters, but because she'd started to see value in the work, in the people around her, and in herself. Outside, she saw Wes by his car. Gathering a few tools he'd stashed in the back, she walked over, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, thanks." He looked up, surprised. "For what?" She cleared her throat, feeling oddly vulnerable. "For just, I don't know, helping me get through this without losing my mind." Wes laughed, leaning against his car. "No problem. Gotta look out for each other, right?" She nodded, feeling a warmth she couldn't quite explain. "Yeah, right." As she walked to her own car, she found herself smiling, a genuine smile that surprised even her. For the first time since she'd started this punishment, she didn't feel trapped. She felt like she was actually part of something real, something meaningful. As she drove home, she replayed Wes's words in her mind. The image of that family's laughter lingered with her, and she wondered if, somehow, this place, this tiny, unassuming restaurant, was teaching her more than her father ever could have predicted. It was a thought that both unsettled and comforted her, and as she pulled into her driveway, she knew one thing. She'd be back tomorrow, ready to give it her all. By now, Lila's routine at the restaurant felt oddly normal. She woke up each day, tied on her apron, and dove into work, chatting with the regulars and helping her coworkers without a second thought. It was a far cry from the life she'd known, but somehow, it had become comfortable, almost rewarding. Her confidence was growing, and she could tell the others were noticing it too. One afternoon, while she was clearing a table, Wes stopped by with a grin. "You know, I almost didn't recognize you there." "You're actually smiling," he teased, She shot him a mock glare but couldn't hide her smirk. "Careful, or I'll dump this tray on you," he laughed, leaning against the counter. "Oh yeah, I'd like to see you try." Before she could reply, Carla called out, "Lila, you've got someone here to see you." Lila turned, her stomach dropping when she spotted her father standing at the entrance. Looking out of place in his tailored suit among the modest decor and bustling staff, she felt a rush of mixed emotions. Nervousness, defiance, and strangely enough, a hint of pride. Howard's expression was unreadable as he took in the scene around him, his gaze finally settling on her with a look of mild surprise. "Dad?" she greeted, trying to keep her voice even as she approached him. "Lila?" he replied, his tone curt but not unkind. "I thought I'd stop by and see how things were going." She crossed her arms, half expecting him to make a snide comment about the restaurant or her new role. "Well, as you can see, I'm still here," Howard nodded, taking in her apron and the trays stacked by the counter. "I'm surprised, actually," he admitted. "I thought you'd have begged to come home by now." Lila felt a small spark of irritation at his assumption, but she kept her expression neutral. "Guess you underestimated me," she said coolly. He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Maybe I did." The two stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the restaurant swirling around them. Lila could sense her co-workers glancing in their direction, curious about the well-dressed stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. Just then, Wes appeared holding a coffee pot and looking between Lila and Howard. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes alert. Howard glanced at him, assessing before returning his attention to Lila. "Who's this?" "Oh, this is Wes," she replied, a hint of defiance in her voice. "He's a friend. One of the best workers here, actually." Wes grinned, extending his hand to Howard. "Nice to meet you, sir. Lila's been doing a great job, if you're wondering." Howard hesitated, then shook Wes's hand with a polite nod. "Good to hear," he said, though his eyes flicked back to Lila, a hint of doubt lingering there. Lila straightened her shoulders, feeling an odd need to prove herself. "I've been learning a lot here," she said, her voice firmer than she'd intended. "I'm not just filling time, Dad. I'm actually getting something out of this." Howard looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge the truth in her words. "Is that so?" he said slowly. "Yes," she replied, her tone unwavering. "And I'm planning to finish what I started." For a brief second, she thought she saw a glimmer of respect in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He cleared his throat, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Well, if that's the case, then I'm glad. I didn't expect this, to be honest." "Neither did I," she admitted, feeling a slight blush creep up her cheeks. Wes, sensing the tension, gave her a quick pat on the shoulder. "I'll give you two a moment," he murmured, slipping back into the kitchen. Howard's eyes followed him, his brow furrowing slightly. "You seem comfortable here," he said, his voice softer. Lila shrugged, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of knowing just how much the place had started to mean to her. "It's a job, Dad. It's not like I'm changing the world." "But you're working," he pointed out. His tone thoughtful. "And that's something." She glanced down, feeling a strange mix of emotions. "Is that what you wanted? For me to just work?" Howard sighed, his expression softening slightly. "I wanted you to understand what it means to build something, to earn respect, rather than expect it. I'm not sure I went about it the right way, but I wanted to give you a perspective you didn't have." Lila nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She couldn't deny that he'd succeeded in his own way, even if she still resented the way he'd gone about it. Working here had changed her, whether she liked it or not. Before she could reply, Carla stepped up, crossing her arms as she addressed Howard. "Mr. Thompson, right?" she asked, her tone blunt. Howard looked at her, slightly taken aback. "Yes, that's me." "Well, your daughter's done good here," Carla said, giving Lila a nod of approval. "She's learning fast." Pulling her weight, "I'd say she's earned a bit of respect." Lila's face heated, caught between pride and embarrassment. She didn't need Carla to vouch for her, but it felt good to have her efforts acknowledged. Howard, looking slightly uncomfortable, managed a nod. "That's good to hear." Carla gave him a quick, appraising look before turning to Lila. "Table 5 is waiting for their check when you're ready." Lila nodded, grateful for the chance to break away. "I'll be right there," she replied, glancing back at her father. "I've got to get back to work, Dad." Howard gave her a slight smile, one that was both proud and a little bewildered. "All right," he said, stepping aside. "I'll let you get to it." As she returned to her tables, she felt her father's eyes on her, watching as she moved between customers, clearing plates and chatting easily with the regulars. She could only imagine what he was thinking, seeing her like this, in a role he never thought she'd embrace. When she finished up, she caught his eye across the room, and he gave her a small nod before heading toward the door. She watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and a lingering ache she couldn't quite name. Wes sidled up beside her, raising an eyebrow. "That looked intense," she shrugged, trying to act casual. "It's just my dad being, well, my dad." Wes nodded knowingly. "Well, for what it's worth, you've come a long way. I don't think he can deny that." She glanced at him, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Wes. I don't think I would have lasted this long without you guys." He smiled. "That's what friends are for." As the shift wound down, Lila found herself thinking back on her father's visit. She'd spent so long resenting his decision to send her here, but now, for the first time, she wondered if maybe he'd seen something in her that she hadn't seen herself, something that needed to change. And as she left the restaurant that evening, she realized she was no longer doing this just to prove him wrong. She was doing it for herself. The next morning, Lila couldn't shake the memories of her father's visit. She replayed the conversation over and over in her mind, each word sticking with her like a thorn. It was the first time she'd seen him acknowledge that her work here meant something, and it left her feeling equal parts proud and frustrated. She wanted him to see how much she'd grown, to understand that she wasn't the same person who'd entered that restaurant weeks ago, but it seemed like he was still holding back, still unsure. When she arrived at work, Wes immediately noticed her distracted mood. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at her with concern. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, though she could tell he wasn't convinced. She forced a smile and adjusted her apron, diving into her tasks with a determination to focus on anything but her father. But as the day wore on, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. The anger she'd felt at his judgment, the pride she'd felt when Carla praised her, all of it clashed inside her, and by the time the lunch rush ended, she was wound up with emotions she didn't know how to express. Wes found her taking a breather in the back, a tray of empty glasses in her hands. "Look, if something's bothering you, you can tell me," he said, leaning against the wall. "I'm a good listener, you know." She glanced at him, hesitating, but the weight of everything building up inside her was too much to hold back, and she let out a sigh. "It's my dad," she admitted. "He came by yesterday and, I don't know, it's like he still doesn't get it. He doesn't see that I've actually changed." Wes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe he's just not used to seeing you like this. Give him time. He's probably processing it in his own way." "I know, but it's frustrating," she replied, feeling a knot of resentment in her chest. "He put me here to teach me some big lesson, but he still treats me like I haven't learned anything." Wes crossed his arms, thinking for a moment. "Have you talked to him? Like, really talked? Maybe he needs to hear it from you." Lila considered this. Realizing how little she'd actually communicated with her father since starting the job, she'd been so determined to prove herself through actions alone, as if words would somehow make her transformation less real. But maybe Wes was right. Maybe it was time she confronted her father directly. No holding back. That evening, after her shift, Leela didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to her father's office, a sleek glass building in the heart of the city, where Howard spent most of his waking hours. She knew he'd still be there. He rarely left before 9, often staying even later as she stepped into the lobby. She felt a pang of nervousness, but she pushed it down. This was something she had to do. When she reached his office, his assistant gave her a surprised look. "Lila, I didn't know you were coming. Is my dad in?" she asked. Glancing at the closed door to his office, the assistant nodded, standing up. "Let me see if he's available." "It's fine," Lila interrupted, already moving toward the door. "I'll just go in." Without waiting for permission, she opened the door and stepped inside, finding her father seated behind his massive oak desk, surrounded by stacks of documents and a computer screen filled with numbers. He looked up, startled, his eyebrows raising in surprise. "Lila, what are you doing here?" She closed the door behind her, taking a deep breath before speaking. "We need to talk, Dad." He set down his pen, leaning back in his chair as he studied her. "All right," he said cautiously. "What's on your mind?" Lila took a few steps closer, her nerves settling as she focused on what she needed to say. "I've been working at that restaurant for weeks now, doing everything you asked. I've cleaned tables, handled customers, worked until I was exhausted, and I've learned a lot, but it still feels like you don't believe it." Howard's expression remained neutral, though she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. "Lila, No, let me finish." She cut him off, her voice gaining strength. "You put me there because you thought I didn't understand what hard work meant. You wanted me to see the world from a different perspective, and I did. I really did. But you keep treating me like I'm still the same spoiled girl you sent in there. And I'm not, Dad. I'm not." For a moment, Howard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on her as he processed her words. Finally, he nodded slowly, letting out a sigh. "Lila, I can see that you've changed. Honestly, I didn't expect you to stick with it this long. I thought you'd quit after the first week." She shook her head, a mixture of anger and hurt bubbling to the surface. "That's exactly the problem, Dad. You didn't think I'd be capable of this. You underestimated me, and I know I wasn't the easiest person to deal with. But maybe you could have believed in me a little more." He looked away, as if ashamed, and his silence spoke volumes. After a moment, he cleared his throat, his tone softer. "You're right, Lila. I'm sorry. I wanted you to learn something, but I didn't give you enough credit to believe you'd actually change. I guess I forgot that you're stronger than I realized." Lila's anger began to soften as she heard the sincerity in his voice. This was the first time she'd seen him so open, so vulnerable, and it took her by surprise. She took a step closer, feeling a wave of emotions she hadn't expected. "I know you're just trying to help me, Dad," she said quietly, "but you have to let me show you who I really am. Let me make mistakes. Let me work through them, and stop expecting me to be perfect." Howard nodded, and for a moment, he looked at her not as his daughter, but as someone he deeply respected. "You're right, Lila. You've shown me more than I expected, and I'm proud of you." The words settled over her like a warm blanket, filling a void she hadn't even realized was there. She swallowed, nodding as a small smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. This was new territory for both of them, a relationship built on mutual respect, rather than expectations. "Will you keep working there?" Howard asked, a trace of curiosity in his voice. Lila nodded. "Yes, I think I want to see this through, at least for now. There's more I can learn there, and I actually like it." Howard's eyes softened, and he nodded in approval. "Then I'll support you. Whatever you decide, just know that I'm here if you need anything." She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I know." As she left his office that evening, Lila felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. She'd finally stood up to her father, not in defiance, but in a way that allowed them both to understand each other. And for the first time, she felt truly free to be herself. No expectations, no pressure, just the chance to prove who she was, both to her father and to herself. The following morning, Lila arrived at the restaurant with a renewed sense of purpose. Her conversation with her father the night before had left her feeling lighter, almost as if a heavy shroud had been lifted. For the first time, she felt like she was here not because of someone else's expectations, but because she genuinely wanted to be. As she tied on her apron and got to work, Wes noticed the subtle change in her mood. He leaned against the counter, grinning. "You look suspiciously happy for someone working a breakfast shift. Everything okay?" She laughed, swatting at him playfully. "Can a girl just be in a good mood without a reason?" He shrugged, smirking. "Usually, but you seem different today. Did something happen?" She thought about telling him, but instead she just smiled, shrugging it off. "Maybe I'm just starting to like it here." Wes raised an eyebrow, feigning shock. "Lila Thompson, actually enjoying work. Now I've seen everything." She rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help but laugh. Don't get too excited, I'm still new to this whole humble and hardworking thing. Yeah, sure, he said with a chuckle. Tell that to the regulars who've started asking if you're working every morning. Lila blinked in surprise. They ask about me. Of course, you've made an impression, whether you know it or not, he replied, giving her a reassuring smile. You've got away with people. His words caught her off guard. She'd spent most of her life thinking of herself as more of a background figure, someone who drifted in and out of social circles without really impacting anyone. The idea that she was actually making a difference here, however small, filled her with a quiet sense of pride. The day continued on as usual, with Lila handling the lunch rush and juggling orders with a newfound ease. She no longer dreaded the chaos, instead embracing the rhythm of the restaurant, the hum of conversations, and the clinking of dishes as they moved from the kitchen to the tables and back again, at the end of her shift, as she hung up her apron. Carla approached her, crossing her arms in her usual stern way, but with a hint of warmth in her gaze. Lila, I have to say, I didn't expect you to last this long, Carla admitted, nodding approvingly. You've done good here. Lila felt a surge of pride. Thanks, Carla. I didn't think I'd last either. I didn't. But I'm glad I did. Carla tilted her head, studying her with a curious look. So, what's next? Are you planning to stick around, or are you ready to move on? Lila hesitated. She hadn't really thought about it. At least, not in any definite terms. Part of her had expected to feel done with the place by now. But the truth was, she wasn't. She wanted to stay. She wanted to keep learning, to keep connecting with the people who had come to mean something to her. I think I want to keep working here, at least for a while longer, she replied, surprising even herself. I feel like there's still more for me to do. Carla's expression softened, and she nodded. Well, you're welcome here as long as you want to stay. Just know that you've earned your place. You're not just Howard Thompson's daughter around here anymore. You're one of us. Lila's chest swelled with gratitude, and she nodded, blinking away the slight sting of emotion in her eyes. Thank you, Carla. That means a lot. As she was gathering her things, Wes caught up to her by the door. So, you're sticking around, huh? He asked, his eyes alight with interest. She nodded, a shy smile playing on her lips. Yeah, I guess I am. He smiled, looking genuinely happy at her decision. Glad to hear it. The place wouldn't be the same without you. They walked outside together, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the street. Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. For once, she wasn't thinking about proving anything or impressing anyone. She was simply enjoying the moment. As they stood by her car, Wes turned to her, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've seen a lot of people come and go around here, but I don't think anyone's changed as much as you have. She looked at him, a little taken aback. You really think I've changed that much? He nodded. Absolutely. When you first came here, you were, well, let's just say you weren't the most enthusiastic person to be around. Lila laughed, shaking her head. That's putting it lightly. But now, he continued, his voice softening, you're different. You care. You connect with people, I think, deep down. You always had it in you. It just took a little push to bring it out. Lila felt a warmth spread through her, the kind that only came from truly being seen. Thanks, Wes. I guess I owe you a lot for that push. He shrugged, his usual easygoing smile back in place. Just doing my part. Besides, you've helped me too. You don't know it, but your determination to stick this out, it's pretty inspiring. They stood there in comfortable silence, both lost in their thoughts. For Lila, the journey had been a surprising one, filled with more lessons than she could have imagined. She thought about all the little things she'd learned, all the ways she'd grown. It was strange to think that just a few weeks ago, she'd hated the idea of even stepping foot in the restaurant. Now, she couldn't imagine leaving. As they said their goodbyes, Wes gave her a quick wave before heading off to his car. She watched him go, feeling a pang of something unfamiliar, a longing. Perhaps, or maybe just a sense of appreciation for the role he'd played in her journey. When she got home, she felt lighter than she had in years. She no longer felt burdened by expectations, or weighed down by the need to prove herself. For the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to be doing. That evening, as she lay in bed, Leela thought about the days ahead. She'd stay at the restaurant, she decided, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She wanted to keep growing, to keep building something real, something meaningful. She wanted to keep learning from the people around her, to keep discovering the parts of herself she'd ignored for so long. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of excitement for the future, a future that, for once, was entirely her own. Lila's decision to stay at the restaurant settled something deep within her. The following weeks passed in a blur of work and laughter, small victories and learning curves, and each day she felt more at home. Her coworkers now treated her like family, sharing stories, jokes, and even frustrations with her, and she found herself truly caring about them. Her connection with Wes grew as well. They often found themselves lingering after hours, sharing drinks and talking about their lives and dreams. He opened up to her about his plans to save for his own auto shop and how he'd been patching together gigs for years just to make ends meet. In turn, she shared stories about her life before the restaurant, confessions she hadn't admitted to anyone else. One afternoon, after the lunch rush had finally slowed, Lila and Wes sat together in the break room, sipping coffee and catching their breath. She noticed he seemed a little distracted, and after a moment, she nudged him gently. "What's up? You're a million miles away." He glanced at her, then looked down. Then, almost shyly, "I've been thinking. My savings. It's almost there. I'm just a few $100s short of what I need to lease a small shop to get my business started." Leela's face lit up with excitement. "Wes, that's amazing. I knew you were close, but wow, that's huge." He gave a half smile, though his eyes betrayed a hint of worry. "Yeah, it is. But I can't help feeling nervous. This is everything I've been working toward. You know, if I mess this up." "You won't mess it up," she interrupted, her tone firm. "You're one of the hardest workers I know, and you've got a real talent, if anyone can pull this off. It's you." He looked at her, something softening in his expression. "Thanks, Lila. That actually means a lot coming from you." She felt a warmth bloom in her chest, the kind that came from seeing someone she cared about believe in themselves. "I mean it, and whatever you need, I'm here to help." Wes nodded, a grateful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks. Actually, I could use some advice, you know, on how to make the place look decent on a shoestring budget." They laughed together, and as the day went on, Lila couldn't stop thinking about how much Wes's dream meant to her too. She found herself plotting ideas, thinking about ways to help him bring his vision to life. For so long, she'd been focused solely on herself, her own needs and her own goals. But now, for the first time, she felt a genuine desire to help someone else succeed. As the sun began to set and they closed up the restaurant, Lila and Wes lingered outside, talking about potential paint colors for his shop and how he could market his services on a budget. Okay, she said, laughing as she held up her hands in surrender. "So maybe my suggestion for a neon sign wasn't the most practical, but hey, it would be eye-catching." Wes chuckled, shaking his head. "You've definitely got a flair for big ideas. I'll give you that." They fell into a comfortable silence, the sounds of the city humming around them. Lila looked over at him, feeling a surge of warmth and gratitude. "Wes, you know, working here, it's changed everything for me, and meeting you has been a big part of that." He looked down, a bit bashful, before glancing back at her with a soft smile. "Same here, Lila. You've changed a lot, and it's been inspiring to watch. You've become part of this place, and part of my life." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, and for a moment, she couldn't find the right response. But before she could speak, Wes cleared his throat and gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "All right, enough of this sappy stuff. Let's get out of here." They both laughed, the moment passing with a lightness that felt natural and comforting. But as Lila headed to her car, she realized that the feeling lingering in her chest was more than just friendship. She cared about Wes in a way she hadn't expected, a way that made her want to stay, to be part of his life as much as he was becoming part of hers. The next few days were filled with the usual routine, but now there was a new energy between them. Their banter was laced with a closeness, an ease that brought them together in small, unexpected ways. Their co-workers started to notice, and more than a few raised eyebrows and smirks were thrown their way, but neither Lila nor Wes addressed it directly. They were both content to let things unfold naturally, enjoying the bond that had blossomed between them one evening as they were closing up. As Carla called Lila over, a rare smile on her face. "Hey, we're planning a little after-hours get-together tomorrow for Maria's birthday. You and Wes should come." Lila's face lit up, touched by the invitation. "Absolutely, I'd love to." "Good," Carla replied, giving her a knowing look. "It's nice having you here. Lila, you've become part of the team, part of this family, I guess." Lila felt a lump rise in her throat at Carla's words. For so long, she'd struggled to find a sense of belonging. And now, here, she had finally found it. "Thanks, Carla. That means more than you know." The following night, the restaurant felt different, more like a home than a place of work. Lila watched as her co-workers gathered around Maria, laughing and toasting her with drinks and snacks. She and Wes stayed close, sharing quiet conversations and inside jokes, and the warmth of the night wrapped around them like a comforting embrace. As the evening wore on, Wes and Lila found themselves standing on the edge of the crowd. Watching the celebration unfold, Wes looked over at her, his eyes filled with a quiet affection. "I think this place was meant for you, Lila. You've made it better." She looked at him, her heart swelling. "No, Wes. This place, and you, it's all made me better." For a moment, they stood there, eyes locked, neither one daring to break the silence. And then, with a courage she didn't quite know she had, Lila reached out, gently touching his hand. He looked down, surprise flickering across his face before he entwined his fingers with hers. They stood there, hand in hand, feeling the bond between them deepen in a way that words couldn't capture. In that quiet moment, Lila realized that this restaurant, these people, and especially Wes, had given her something she'd never known she was missing: a sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging, and a future that felt real. The night went on, but for Lila and Wes, that simple, shared moment by the edge of the celebration was a promise. A promise that whatever came next, they would face it together, side by side. The days following Maria's birthday celebration were filled with a new lightness for Lila. She and Wes had slipped into an easy rhythm, both on and off the clock, and it felt natural, almost inevitable. She found herself looking forward to their time together and cherishing the small moments they shared between orders and closing up. For the first time in her life, she wasn't counting down days or hours. She was simply present. One afternoon, during a lull in the shift, Lila's phone buzzed with a message from her father. "We need to talk. Come by the house tonight." There was no explanation, but the brief, serious tone made her stomach twist with a mix of curiosity and nerves. It had been weeks since their confrontation in his office, and she wondered if he'd had time to fully process her transformation. After her shift, Lila drove to her father's estate, the familiar sight of the gated entrance and sprawling gardens making her feel strangely out of place. It was funny. This used to be her entire world, and now it felt distant, like she was visiting the life of someone she barely knew. When she entered, she found Howard in his study, surrounded by papers, his expression unreadable. He looked up as she entered, nodding in acknowledgement before gesturing for her to sit. "Thanks for coming," he began, his voice steady but serious. "Of course," she replied, sitting down and crossing her hands in her lap, sensing the weight of whatever he was about to say. Howard leaned back, studying her for a moment. "Lila, I've been thinking about the changes I've seen in you. I underestimated you. I didn't realize how much potential you had. And I'm proud of you." Her heart swelled at his words, but she sensed there was more to come, so she waited. He cleared his throat, looking down at his hands as if choosing his words carefully. "I know I pushed you into that restaurant job as a form of discipline, and it was my way of trying to teach you something. But I think I might have been projecting." She raised her eyebrows, taken aback. "Projecting?" He nodded slowly, a distant look in his eyes. "You see, I built this life, this wealth, from nothing. And in doing that, I lost sight of a lot of things. Relationships, time, even happiness. They all took a backseat to my work. I didn't want you to fall into that same trap, but maybe I was too harsh." Lila's gaze softened, and she began to see him not as the strict father she'd grown up with, but as a man who had sacrificed more than she'd realized. "Dad, I didn't know. I didn't understand how much it took for you to get here." Howard gave a small, rueful smile. "And I didn't give you enough credit for figuring it out on your own. You didn't just survive that job. You embraced it, learned from it. I thought I was going to teach you, but maybe I'm the one who's learned something." The weight of his words settled over her, filling her with a sense of quiet respect. She hadn't just been proving herself to him all these weeks. She'd been helping him see himself more clearly, too. "Thank you for saying that, Dad," she said softly. "I guess we both needed this in ways we didn't expect." Howard nodded, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "I want you to know, Lila, that whatever you choose to do from here on out, whether you want to stay at the restaurant, explore something new, or even if you need help with something, I'll support you. You've shown me that you can handle it, that you're capable." Lila's throat tightened, and she fought back the emotions welling up inside her. "Thank you, Dad. That means more than you know." He reached across the desk, placing a hand on hers. "No, thank you, Lila. I didn't realize how much I needed to see this side of you." They sat in silence for a moment, sharing a rare moment of mutual understanding that felt like a new beginning. After a few minutes, Lila rose to leave, a sense of peace settling over her as she realized that, for the first time, she and her father were truly seeing each other. That night, Lila lay in bed, replaying their conversation in her mind. She'd spent so long fighting against his expectations, against the walls he'd put up around her life, that she hadn't stopped to consider what he'd been protecting her from. She understood now. He wasn't just trying to keep her in line. He was trying to keep her from making the same sacrifices he had. And in his own way, he'd given her a gift far more valuable than money or security. He'd given her the chance to discover who she really was. The next day, Lila arrived at the restaurant with a quiet confidence that felt more grounded than ever. She didn't need anyone's approval. She was here because she wanted to be, because she had chosen this path, and no one could take that from her. As she tied her apron and slipped behind the counter, Wes approached her with a curious grin. "You look like you're up to something," he teased. She laughed, shaking her head. "Let's just say I've had a little revelation." "Oh yeah, care to share with the class?" She looked at him, smiling softly. "Maybe later. But let's just say, I think I finally understand what this place has been teaching me all along." Wes nodded, his gaze warm. "Well, whatever it is, it looks good on you." They spent the shift in their usual rhythm, trading jokes and sharing stories. But there was a new lightness to Lila, a sense of purpose that even Wes couldn't help but notice. By the end of the day, she felt completely at ease, ready to face whatever came next without hesitation. As they finished up, Wes leaned against the counter, watching her with a thoughtful look. "You're different, Lila, this place. It's really gotten to you." She smiled, nodding. "Yeah, I guess it has. It's funny. I thought I was just passing through, but it turns out this place has been more of a home than anywhere else." He tilted his head, giving her a knowing look. Sometimes the places that change us are the ones we least expect. They shared a quiet moment, the weight of his words settling between them. And for the first time, Lila felt truly at peace with the journey she'd been on, the people she'd met, and the person she was becoming. As they locked up the restaurant that night, she realized that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. The morning sun peeked over the city, casting warm light through the restaurant windows as Lila arrived to start her shift. The hum of the early customers, the clink of mugs and plates, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. This small, simple place, with its cozy booths and familiar faces, had become her sanctuary. And today, as she walked through the door, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment she hadn't known she'd been searching for. As the morning unfolded, Lila moved through the restaurant with ease. Greeting customers and chatting with the regulars like they were old friends, she'd found her place here, and it showed. The once awkward, skeptical girl who had resisted every task was now comfortable, grounded, and fully herself. Her co-workers noticed it too, often stopping to give her a quick nod or smile in appreciation of how far she'd come. Wes was by her side, as usual, helping her navigate the small tasks and enjoying their familiar rhythm. As they worked, he leaned over with a smirk. "So, Miss Thompson, what's next for you?" She laughed, shaking her head. "For now, I'm right where I want to be." He raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in his eyes. "That's what I like to hear. I never thought I'd see the day you'd actually enjoy being here." She nudged him with her elbow. "Hey, don't act too surprised. I can be full of surprises, you know." The banter flowed easily between them, but there was a warmth beneath it that hadn't been there before, a shared understanding, a feeling of mutual respect and admiration. They both knew that this experience had changed them, brought them closer together in ways neither had anticipated. As the lunch crowd began to trickle in, Carla gathered the staff together for a quick huddle. She looked around at each of them, her usual stern demeanor softened by a smile. "All right, team. I just want to say you've all done a great job these past few weeks. The restaurant's been busier than ever, and I couldn't ask for a better crew." Everyone murmured their thanks, and Lila felt a swell of pride. She was part of this team, part of something real and meaningful. This place wasn't just a job anymore. It was a family. After the huddle, Wes turned to her, his eyes serious. "You know, Lila, I think Carla's right. You've really made a difference here. You've turned this place into something better." She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's funny. I think I came here to learn something, but I ended up finding something even more important." "Like what?" he asked, his gaze intent. "Like purpose," she replied softly. "Like a place I belong, people I care about, a life that's mine." Wes smiled, his hand brushing against hers as they shared a quiet moment. "You deserve it, Lila. You really do." Before she could respond, a familiar figure appeared at the door. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw her father standing there, looking slightly out of place yet somehow content. He offered her a small, tentative smile as he approached. "Dad?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Howard glanced around, taking in the lively scene of the restaurant. "I wanted to see this place you've been talking about, I thought. Maybe I could grab a cup of coffee. That is, if you'll serve me." Lila laughed, the tension in her chest dissolving as she gestured to an open table. "I think we can make that happen." Howard sat down, and she brought him a coffee, setting it in front of him with a warm smile. He looked up at her, his gaze full of admiration. "You look happy here, Lila. Really happy." She nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. "I am, Dad, and I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. I used to think I had it all, but I didn't really have anything until I found purpose. And I think I found it here." Howard's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm proud of you, Lila, more than I can put into words." For the first time, Lila felt an unspoken peace settle between them, a quiet understanding that required no further explanation. Her father had pushed her toward this experience, but it was her own courage, her own resilience that had transformed it into something meaningful. As the day went on, Lila returned to her tasks, weaving between tables, exchanging smiles with customers, and laughing with her co-workers. She could feel her father's eyes on her, observing the world she had built here. And for once, she felt no pressure to prove anything. She was proud of who she'd become, and she knew he was too. Later, as the last few customers filtered out and the day wound down, Lila and Wes found themselves outside, standing under the glow of the streetlights. The quiet of the evening wrapped around them, and Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her. "So," Wes began, his voice soft, "do you still feel like this is just a job?" She shook her head, smiling. "No, it's so much more than that." He took a step closer, his eyes warm. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. You've made a difference in more ways than you know." Lila met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. "I feel the same way, Wes. I wouldn't be who I am right now without you." They stood in silence, the weight of the journey they'd shared lingering in the air. And as he reached out, taking her hand in his, she felt the promise of something beautiful, something lasting, growing between them. Together, they walked down the quiet street, hand in hand, with the restaurant lights fading behind them. This journey, with all its twists and turns, had brought her to a place she hadn't even known she was looking for. a place of belonging, a purpose she could call her own, and the beginning of a new life shaped by the strength she'd found within herself. And as they disappeared into the night, Lila knew that, wherever the road led next, she was ready.